Welcome back to the series that Shane and I have been putting on, covering instructions on multicolor, multi-layer, however you want to say it, epoxy pours. This is going to be part 6 of the series, and in this part of the series I want to cover a couple items from previous videos. As we looked at the last video, I ended that with milling the green, white, and black colors, and I ended that showing you a couple of challenges that we see in that after the milling. I had a couple holes in the green, didn't turn out quite like I wanted it to. Let's take a review of that right at this time. Before I go back to the issues we saw in the milling process, let me take a minute to share with you an excerpt from the Mark Lindsay Live CNC show this last Sunday, where Shane and I were guests in trying to share some insights. And so I'm going to cut into an excerpt where Shane is actually talking about filling voids and how good it feels when you have no holes. Unfortunately, I didn't have that luxury in this case, so I have to go back to repairing. But thought it would be good to share with you. Even the master, Mr. Shane, will have that happen occasionally. And although I took precautions, as you might remember when I was talking about how to pour the white, I still had that issue. So let's share Shane's discussion.
So I just kind of like will just get the Dixie cup, dip a toothpick in it, and then just kind of like let it go drop by drop where it needs to go. And the big secret here is not secret, but the one thing you'll find out if you don't know this already is if you cover up a hole, epoxy is really good at trying to make a bubble, but there's a good chance there's going to be a bubble under that hole that you covered up. So what I'll try to do is take that toothpick and I'll dip it in the epoxy, and then I'll put it down into what I'm about to pour into. If it's a real small area, and I kind of swirl the toothpick to like let the epoxy touch the sides a little bit. Then I make sure that I scoop with the toothpick to get epoxy out so it doesn't try to cover. And then I take another couple drops and I put it right on the corner, and then the epoxy will want to run in with itself because there's epoxy on the sides, and epoxy loves epoxy. So it will just kind of follow itself down into the hole, and you'll watch it rise up. Now for me, this is very nerdy, but I love, one of my best feelings I get when I'm pouring epoxy in some of those really small holes is when I can see that thing rising to the top and I know I don't have a bubble underneath. That is a very, very relieving feeling because there's nothing worse than flattening off a project and realizing you have bubbles on there that you're going to try to color match. It's not going to happen. I just recut the whole, I'll recut it, start over, but a lot of people try to color match, and that's just up to the person who's doing it,
So go ahead and think back to what Shane was just talking about, the bubbles. And I have bubbles in this location right here, and I have bubbles in this location right here, and right here in the white. And so I went ahead and tried to repair those. I'm going to share that in this video with you about my repair. But also remember what he said about color matching, and that ended up being a problem for me. I didn't get the color quite right here. And then the other thing I wanted to do was these green lines weren't as wide as I had expected them to be. I don't know whether that's because I milled them down, and the V-bit gets smaller as you go down, or I just didn't keep them wide enough to begin with. And they also didn't pop like I wanted them to pop. So I went ahead and tried to repair that, and I'll share that with you, and I'll share the results. So let's move on from this standalone picture to the videos on what I tried to do. Trying to shove the epoxy down into those holes. So after we get this filled, this will all be sanded back off. You got to watch these now for rebubbles. So I'll put a little heat on it just to check it out, see what happens, see if it bubbles up. And I'm hoping that's going to fill it. Looks a little brighter right now, but hopefully after we send it, we won't see the difference as much.
Color match, not gonna happen. I just recut the whole, I'll recut it, start over, but a lot of people try to color match and
if you don't get it right the first time. Okay, the repair has been completed with the white and dry, so now I'm getting ready to sand it off, and then we'll see if I want to do any recarving with the green, because the green did not turn out as impressive as I had hoped. It's kind of dark and blended in and kind of thin. I may need to make that whiter. Okay, I'll do initial quick sand of this repair and take a look at it and then decide what I want to do with that, green or not. Okay, I may need to go down to 150 just because there's a little more resin than I expected. I normally try to stay as high as I can because that means more sanding to get all the scratches out when I put them in with the sandpaper, but sometimes I have to go down. I'm not very happy right now at this point because this white became overly bright, so I'm trying to figure that out, how to repair it. Can you hear Shane?
color match, not gonna happen. I just recut the whole, I'll recut it, start over. But
at this time, let's go ahead and discuss the green. One of my frustrations was the green didn't quite look like I wanted it to when I ended up milling it. So as you can see, the green lines were not popping, as I discussed before, but the other issue was that they weren't quite as wide as I actually wanted them to be. If you look at the logo above it, the one that I was working from, the green is a little wider and brighter. So I wanted to work on that, and that's what I did. I went and adjusted in the software the width of the vectors. I didn't put that into this YouTube video because we've shown you a couple times how to adjust the offsets and make things wider, and I'll show that again in some other future video. But I started with me actually using the changes I made in the vectric software and starting to cut the green at the CNC. Okay, what I'm preparing to do right now is I'm going to re-zero this bit because I don't like how wide this green was. This green's got to be a little wider. So I've made some adjustments in the software, and I'm going to recarve out the green and re-pour it. This is part of the long process that it takes to get things just right. So that's where I'm headed. I'm going to initially zero the bit. I'm going to get a scratch cut just to make sure that I readjusted the vectors correctly, something that I could sand out if I wanted to, and then I'll go ahead and cut it deeper and re-pour the green. I'm trying to see if it's doing any scratching at this time so I can see it. So no, so I'll zero it down just a little more. Remember, I only have it cutting at a depth of 0.002. We'll start it again. I approach this very carefully not to goof up the whole project. I still can't see a scratch here, so I can't tell whether it's going to be online like I want it. It looks good, but I'm going to lower it down a little more. Okay, now it's got a little scratch. Okay, now I'm going to just go ahead and check for alignment and see how it looks. To me, it looks like it's going to be pretty good. So I'm going to go ahead and recarve and go down to the right depth now. So this time I've gotten the black recarved. It's all carved out. You can see it's much wider. Or I don't know whether you can see it on the camera. We'll see. It's much wider, 0.02 wider than it was before. That should give it a little more depth, or I would say thickness, to make it look more like the original logo, that picture that I got. And I will also not put a tinge of black in it this time. I'll keep it a lighter color because it was just blending in with the black. Shane told me to go ahead and mix a little white powder in with it also. Now with this fast set for quick repairs in small areas, this can dry in up to 6 hours to be able to work. So my plan is, so give this about 6 hours, check for hardness, and then sand it versus mill it. All I'm doing right now is working it around into the various tracks, trying to keep as much of the buildup off the rest of the board so that it'll be easier for me to sand it off, yet making sure everything's filled. Here's a bubble right there. Okay, now it's time to let it harden. Watch for bubbles. Come hit the torch for just a couple times, not very much, because you can cook this fast stuff real easy. One other thing to point out, I don't know whether we'll be able to see it, is this fast set epoxy gets really, really hot and can actually melt through this container if you're not careful. So this is what's left over after I made my pour. And let's see if I can get a read on this. So it's at 145 degrees Fahrenheit. I don't know if you can see that. It's flipping around depending on what spot I hit. But it got up to 145. But I don't know. Can you see the bow? Now it's hot to the touch. It's actually starting to melt the plastic. So be very, very careful. 193, 200 degrees. 193, 200 degrees. I'm going to take it outside and dispose of the epoxy, spread it out so it doesn't heat up so much. Originally I had planned on just sanding this. You might have heard me say that earlier in the video. But after I saw the amount of overpour, and talked with Shane, I went ahead and started to mill it, and you'll see me reach over every once in a while and touch the board because I noticed there was a little bow, and I wanted to make sure it was held down nice and tight and that the clamps were working right. So every once in a while you'll have seen that. When I got done with the milling process, I was feeling pretty good actually. This looks much more like what I wanted to see with the wider green lines, and the only thing that I was disappointed about was that the the color wasn't matching, and I knew I was going to be having problems with that. But I felt good about the green. What I hadn't anticipated was that the carve, when I set the depth, I had only set it for 0.06 deep, and how much the actual milling had taken off the green. So although it looks really good right now, let's watch what happens after I finish the sanding process. And remember, the board was slightly bowed, so there was taking a little more off, I think, on the inside of this board, and we'll see that at the end, which was a disappointing outcome, but lessons learned. And we'll go through some lessons learned at the end of the video to talk about what I learned from this project. Stepping up to 320. $280, I mean. Here's the final results of this effort. Overall, it looks pretty nice except for the areas that we were worried about. You can see the green coloring there. It's not full. It wasn't deep enough, so I sanded it away. You can also see the white there in the G is a different color, along with a couple of those dots down there, which is frustrating. And so all in all, this is not acceptable for me to give to the client, and I'm going to have to redo it. And as Shane said,
color match is not going to happen. I just recut the whole, I'll recut it, start over. But
color match, he's going to start right from the beginning. So Shane's advice holds true again. I'm going to have to redo this 3-color logo, but in the interim, I will work with the client for a solution to meet their immediate needs. In the event you're curious, this was the solution for the client. They had wanted me to build a new trophy, including their old trophy. So I used their old trophy. I went ahead and made a miter box out of the plaque that I had just went through the last video series on. Say I used India ink for the black. I think it turned out pretty darn nice, except for the parts that weren't good with the 3-color logo. I put their old trophy on top of it, and they were able to give this out at their fantasy football party, and I am making them a new trophy. Will be slightly different and have some other characteristics beside their old trophy just sitting on top of a box. Well, and as hard as we try, things don't always go like we plan. I had originally planned this video to be something that I could demonstrate that everything went perfect, but it doesn't. The world isn't perfect. So let's cover a few things we covered in this video, but also in this series about multicolor epoxy pours as a way to wrap up this part of the epoxy journey. We'll make future videos as things come up, some demonstration of other projects, some demonstration of manipulating vectors between Shane and I will be coming up with future videos. But for this series, let's talk about some things we learned during the series and also with this last repair effort. I think the number one thing that you need to be aware of, or we need to be aware of, is the size of the vectors are critical when you're designing your project to ensure epoxy is deep enough to withstand the milling process and allow for epoxy entry. So I had problems in the O on my G, I say O, the center circle part of my G, and the little period areas. And although those were on the border of being just large enough, if I had made those vectors just slightly bigger, I would have had a better chance of not forming those bubbles in those areas. Also, the same thing is with the green around the white, and I had that black center area. If I would have made that green just a little bit wider, then when I milled, it wouldn't have gotten so thin. We'll talk about the color part here in a minute. So the wider the better, and you may need to actually have a starting depth greater than 0 if what you're trying to accomplish won't get you deep enough. But then you're in danger of actually making your vectors impacting your vectors at the top. So it's a trick you can do, but it's better just to start from the beginning and looking at your vectors. Now, one thing I didn't cover in this series, which I will cover in a future series, is size of vector and the bit you're using and how deep you should expect it to carve or have a pretty close proximity to how deep it's going to carve, so you can get a better picture for how much milling you might be able to do on the end product. I actually didn't have that information before. I was going by experience and getting insights from Shane, but since developing this series of multicolor epoxy videos, I started thinking about things a little more scientifically, and I now have a table, thanks to Mr. Rob Schuster, that I'll share in a future video, where he has actually calculated the depth of cut you can get based on the V-bit you're using and the size of the vector. I think that'll be very interesting to some, and that'll come out in the very near future. Thanks, Rob. When you're pouring in a small area, Shane talked about this before, about using about using a toothpick to stir it in and then pouring from the side and watching the epoxy go in.
So I just kind of like will just get the Dixie cup, dip a toothpick in it, and then just kind of like let it go drop by drop where it needs to go. And the big secret here is not secret, but the one thing you'll find out if you don't know this already is if you cover up a hole, epoxy is really good at trying to make a bubble, but there's a good chance there's going to be a bubble under that hole that you covered up. So what I'll try to do is take that toothpick and I'll dip it in the epoxy, and then I'll put it down into what I'm about to pour into. It's a real small area, and I kind of swirl the toothpick to let the epoxy touch the sides a little bit. Then I make sure that I scoop with the toothpick to get epoxy out so it doesn't try to cover. And then I take another couple drops and I put it right on the corner, and then the epoxy will want to run in with itself because there's epoxy on the sides, and epoxy loves epoxy. So it will just kind of follow itself down into the hole, and you'll watch it rise up. Now, for me, this is very nerdy, but I love, one of my best feelings I get when I'm pouring epoxy into some of those really small holes is when I can see that thing rising to the top and I know I don't have a bubble underneath. That is a very, very relieving feeling.
I really didn't do that. I did do the stirring of the taking the toothpick and putting it in, and sometimes the toothpick would barely fit in. That might have been a sign that I wasn't going to get the epoxy in there in itself because it was small, so I might have actually needed to been assigned to actually make the vector a little bit bigger. But in any event, you saw what happened. I got the bubbles, and as Shane said, we all can get the bubbles. He gets them every once in a while and has to start over, but I probably should have taken, even though I talked about that when I was pouring the white, I probably could have taken a little more effort in some of the those smaller areas that might have tended to void to ensure that they were filling up with epoxy, and I wasn't just covering over them with some kind of film that later, when I milled it, came off. So pay attention to that when you're pouring your epoxy. Don't get overly anxious and pour all of it when you have small areas that might need some extra attention, like I had in that G, the little dots in the next to the crown, etc. Make sure you're paying attention to those areas, and try to watch better that the epoxy flows in it before you start over pouring the epoxy. Hopefully that makes sense. Another thing we should keep in mind is that repairs are not always straightforward and simple, especially when you get to color matching. If you have a problem with the color matching, in other words, with the white, I had mixed a couple different colors. I had mixed some pigment, some Pearl X from vCarve, and some white liquid, and so when I tried to match those didn't match up as well as I would have liked. The white got too bright, not enough Pearl X in it, and therefore I guess it could have gone forward, but it didn't meet my standards because that G was just too bright. The other thing to think about is when you are going to try to recut and re-pour an area, such as, say, I couldn't do that with the white. I was bounded by the black G. But with the green, when I went to re-pour it, the first thing I did, and I didn't show that in the video series, was I slightly widened each of the vectors, that green vector all the way around. I slightly widened it. I widened it by 0.02. So that it was a vector width that was about 0.08 or so when I was done, and that would allow it to get deep enough. And the other thing I was doing was making sure I was going beyond the original vector, meaning I needed to encompass both sides of the vector. And so I needed to ensure that before I actually cut it, that the tool path and the way I had mounted the board all were going to result in the original green being taken out, and that it didn't encroach on the black too much such that it was going to disappear. So if you remember, you have the white, then you have the black, and then you have the green. And so I needed to make sure there was still going to be a black line between the two. So what I did was I did the scratch toolpath, you may remember. Go back and look at that, which means I barely scratched the surface enough to where I could even sand it out if I wanted to, if I didn't like the way the new toolpath was going to cut. And to do that, it took me 3 different times of zeroing it. So I zeroed it, started to cut a little bit, saw it wasn't even scratching, and then I re-zeroed it down 0.1 mils, did it again, still wasn't cutting, and then I went ahead and did it one more Z down of 0.1 mil, until I finally saw that it wasn't scratching, and then I did one scratch coat, and I inspected that scratch coat to make sure it encompassed that green. And once I had that, then I was able to go ahead and run the full tool path. So you have to have patience when you're trying to line things up to make sure you're not taking out too much or too little of the vector that you're trying to replace. Color mixing is not straightforward to achieve the desired color. And here I'm talking about, we talked about the white not matching, which is problematic if you have to re-pour. But my original color, I didn't mix up the way I had thought I was mixing it up. I thought I was mixing it up such that it was going to pop more, and by putting the little couple drops of black in it versus putting white in it, I actually made it so it blended into the black more. And because I didn't have the vector wide enough initially, when I milled it, that vector got thin. Remember, we're talking about a V-bit. So as you mill down, the wideness of the vector actually gets less. And so two things, it was too dark, and I already talked about it not being wide enough to begin with. And so therefore, pay attention to the colors as much as you can. I don't have that skill set. I'm continuing to build it on what it's going to actually look like. That comes with experience, and Shane is an expert at that, and I usually ask him. And I asked him the wrong color. So when I originally asked him, I asked him something other than making it pop. I just said, how do you make the green darker? Well, because I was thinking I would put some blue, and he said, no, I'll put a drop of black in there. What I really wanted to ask him is, how do you make it stand out against the black? So think about that. The milling depth can be adversely impacted by the wood movement, and that's what I saw with the green a little bit. There was 2 problems with the green disappearing. Number one is I milled it once already before I made the repair. So that already took off some of the depth of the epoxy. And this is what happens when you start to try to do repairs is you're compounding how much you're milling. So the milling depth can be adversely impacted by multiple times of milling and also by wood movement. And you saw me in the video, I actually said, hey, I was pushing down on that wood because it looked like it was a little warped or it had a little movement, and it was. So that meant I was taking off a little more, very slight, but enough epoxy to make a difference on the end that when I finally sanded it, part of my green disappeared. You remember right after the milling, it looked really pretty nice. But after I sanded it just a little bit using a couple grits of sandpaper, the green basically disappeared because it just had just a very skim amount of resin in there. So be very careful about milling. And in this case, when I was originally going to do it, I wasn't going to use the bit. I wasn't going to mill it with a bit. I was going to just sand it down, and I probably would have been okay if I'd have done that. But I didn't have the patience to actually just sand it because it takes a lot longer when you're sanding the resin versus milling it. So there's an example of where my patience got the better of me. I thought, well, I'll just mill it just a little bit. I'll mill it just a little bit, and then I'll have not that much sanding. And in this case, it didn't serve me well. So think about that. How much patience do you have? And should you actually be milling it, or should you just be sanding it down? Those are things you can think about. As hard as it is to accept when we have to do color matching, just remember what Shane told us.
Color match is not going to happen. I just recut the whole, I'll recut it, start over.
So a couple multicolor epoxy future ideas or ideas that I'm thinking about pursuing are a video on vector sizes and impact on cut depth and space for epoxy. That's the one that Rob Schuster shared a spreadsheet with me and he said I could share. The other one is information about bits used and when to use them. Get into a little bit more on that. Thinking about doing a couple example projects that people can follow and cut and pour if desired. I have a USN seal. I'm a veteran Navy. I would like to make a seal and use that in either a flag or something else for my home. If you have ideas for future videos, please submit those in the comment section, or if you have questions, go ahead and submit those. One of the things I'm thinking about is I've had people send me some of their projects since following this epoxy series, and I think that's really cool, seeing how other people are developing their talents and how they're getting brave enough to go experiment. Some of them were probably doing it before, but at least they shared them with me. What do you think about an occasional video demonstrating or highlighting a project from people that are following this effort and sharing them? How about if you think that would be a good idea, just say so in the comments section. It's been a true pleasure doing this series to date. I plan on doing more videos for you. And if you like what you're seeing, please hit that thumbs up. If you have any comments or ideas for future videos, go ahead and share those in the comments section. And share this video so others can follow us in the adventure. And also subscribe if you want to be part of the future videos that I make. I appreciate all that you do, and I appreciate all that you contribute to my learning. And with this, I'd like to say have a wonderful day and have a wonderful life until we get a chance to interface again. Thank you.